And this is part 4 of the talk at, on history of India, done at Osher USF in Tampa in 2017. Last time we ended with the history of 1857 Indian Sepoy Mutiny, as the British would call, and the War of Independence, as the Indians would call. And as we remember, the news was late in reaching London, and with superior forces, better communication, and better weaponry, the East India Company was able to put down the mutiny. And now the causes of failure of mutiny we reviewed that included it was localized to the northern region of the country, and the Sikhs and the Gurkhas did not participate in it, and neither did the various princely states. And the mutineers were poorly organized, and the leadership was fragmented. Now, after the mutiny, there was a lot of self-examination that took place in the British Parliament as to this literally shocked them, and finally there was a lot of finger pointing that went on, and party politics was involved. And at that time, by coincidence, the party leadership changed, and the Tories, or the Conservative Party led by Disraeli, took over, and he made a strong case for blaming the East India Company for poor administration and mismanagement of the empire, and that led to dissolution of the East India Company, and Queen Victoria became the Empress of India, and that was the start of the direct rule, which lasted for almost 90 years, as we'll examine in this part. Now, again, that there was already a substantial amount of segregation taking place, but this mutiny consolidated it further, that the British establishment and the administrators and the military confined themselves to the outside of the main cities, what they call civil lines, and segregated even more, and maintained contact only when it is necessary through the staff that collaborated with them, which was mostly Hindu and in the administrative aspect, and Muslim in the military. And so, and the army was confined to the barracks outside. And again, some of the cities that were ravaged, like Lucknow and Patna, they were rebuilt with the idea that there would be long boulevards so they could fire cannon shots as needed. And again, the racial segregation that took place became more rigid. Now, even amongst Europeans, there were various classes, the top one being the administrators, and then the military, followed by the what they used to call boxwallas or traders, and the tea merchants, and the salesmen were at the last. And again, as you can see, that the racism was permeated even to selling soap, as to the white man's burden, the classical statement, and books by Rudyard Kipling became the law. And at the same time, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the women had started traveling to the subcontinent, and they put their foot down as to the soldiers who were living with the local women, and the sexual relationship that led to the rise to a big community of legitimate and illegitimate children, and that was put down. And in joking, it was called the fishing fleet, that the eligible daughters were sent with a fixed amount to find a suitable husband, the desirable catch being the military or the administrative people.
Items you have previously purchased on Amazon.
Now, again, by this time, even before the 1857, in order to train Indians as go-between and to train them with Western education. Various colleges were started. There was a Jesuit college that was started in Portuguese Goa, and some other colleges that were started by the Portuguese, primarily Xavier's College. And the printing press was introduced, and after 1757, the English started various colleges, starting with the Hindu College, and several universities were started in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. And these were primarily liberal arts colleges and law. And mostly the people who took advantage of that were mostly the upper class Brahmins. The Muslims were rather late in getting to the Muslim university in northern India. And again, the educational professional class was being created, and the pace of education slowly progressed. And there were a substantial number of universities by the early 20th century. Again, it must be emphasized that most of the students who participated were males, and there were a few women's colleges, but they were lagging behind. And there was also establishment of law colleges and some medical colleges on both coasts. And again, the people who were trained and subsequently traveled to Oxford and Cambridge, they became the hotbed of Indian nationalism. And the curriculum primarily followed the standard British establishment laid out by Oxford and Cambridge, that is heavy on classics and literature and law, and rather weak on sciences and engineering. Now, again, India was always subject to the wills and whims of monsoon, and with failure of monsoon and with exporting of the grains, a famine took place. Now, by this time, capitalism and market force theory was in vogue, as it was apparent in Ireland, and hundreds of thousands of Irish died due to potato famine. Now, the same philosophy was continued in India, that the government refused to purchase grain and distribute to the poor. And finally, they did institute some relief works, but the amount of food grain that was provided was meager, about only 1 pound per day, and with only 1/16 of a rupee for hard days of work. And this caused a huge amount of misery, and as many as 5.5 million people were thought to have died. Now, again, at that time, the poor people had no choice but to seek their fortune elsewhere. As you may recall, slavery was abolished in the British Empire by that time in the islands of Fiji and the West Indies, and so they needed cheap labor. And the agents of the East India Company, which were most of them were Hindus and Muslims, enticed the people from the interiors with rather fake promises and made them sign and as contract laborers for a span of 7 years. But again, their salaries were poor, the working conditions were horrible, to put it mildly, and most of them ended up not returning and ended up settling in Fiji and the West Indies, as primarily what was formed at that time called British Guiana. And again, the classic example of one of their generation is Nobel winner V.S. Naipaul. And the majority of population of Fiji was still Indian, and even until present day, the fighting between the local African population as well as the native population of Fiji Islanders and the Indians have continued and power struggle have continued in both East and West settlements. And now, in spite of this, the show must go on. So Queen Victoria was crowned the Empress, and at that time, just to impress the natives, to show the power of the British Empire, the pomp and circumstances, a big show of Delhi Darbar was conducted, and all the Maharajas and Nawabs and the Sultans, along with various intellectuals, were invited to participate in a big show of strength and pageantry and gallantry. And again, this was considered that by that time the promises were given that Her Majesty would grant India similar political rights and treat all her subjects evenly, but the actual practice departed away from the promises that were given. Now, again, as you can see, that the influence of English and India was bilateral, and quite a new vocabulary had developed by that time, and it was tongue-in-cheek was labeled as hops and jops, and the various words which are very well familiar with an average English speaker were incorporated into Oxford English Dictionary. The words such as veranda, bungalow, pajamas, bazaar, and the subtitle reveals of the book revealed a glossary of colloquial Anglo-English words and phrases of historical, geographic, and other importance. And one quote that actually tongue-in-cheek reveals this as to, while having a tiffin on the veranda of my bungalow, I spilled category on my dungaree and had to go to the gymkhana in my pajamas looking like a coolie. And so these just shows nearly almost all the words that we have come to recognize as of Indian origin. And these are some of the examples of the relationships of Indians and the British, and the Anglo-Indian community is relatively small, only 500,000 worldwide of mixed ancestry. But even though some of them were lighter in color, they were rejects of both words. And originally the word Anglo-Indian was used for British people who were born and living in India, but then subsequently came to be recognized as people of mixed ancestry. And a classic example of them are as outlined as the famous actor Ben Kingsley, who portrayed Gandhi, European actress, American actresses named Merle Oberon and Vivian Leigh, who had over at least some Indian heritage in their genetic history. And subsequently, they were discriminated against again by both cultures, and most of them, those who were living in India, ended up working in the railway industry or working as clerks for the East India Company, and subsequently for the British Crown. Now, as I mentioned, the Indian diaspora is widespread along with not just Fiji and West Indies and Suriname, but also in Malaya and East and South Africa. And again, this had to do with working as cheap laborers, as coolies, with the expansion of the empire, building up the railways, sugar industry, and then they went in as petty merchants and tried to make their fortune in these colonies along the tail of the British. Now, we mentioned earlier about as early as 1857, the capital of Shimla was established as the summer capital of the British Raj, and was officially in 1867. That's again with the building of railways, and that became easier to transport all the machinery of the empire to the northern cooler climates. And again, the Shimla was very exclusive, and the Indians were not allowed to even walk on the streets unless they were employed as servants or as clerks in the service of the empire. And that discrimination continued until very late. And the Shimla society was well described in some of Kipling's exploits, and starting from the early 19th century and further on. Now, again, we'll talk more about the Afghan wars, and as we mentioned, the first Afghan war that took place in as early as 1839, and after 3 years of control, the Brits decided to give up and and for the first time ended up losing almost all of the army while retreating. And subsequently, further forays were taken up, primarily in order to prevent the spread of the Russian Empire. First, during the time of the Tsar, when the Tsar's army was conquering various stans one by one, and they were expanding, and they were afraid that they would be, and they were making friendship gestures to Afghanistan and Iran, and that frightened the British Empire, and that came to be known as Great Game, which continued for several, almost 50 plus years. And that led to the Second Afghan War. And again, that after a couple of years ended in a stalemate, and the border was outlined between the northwest frontier and Afghanistan. And at that time, the Afghans, in return for payment, agreed not to make further expansion and give up some of the control of what came to be known as Northwest Territories, and which is still a very ill-defined border, which is still become a headache for present-day Pakistan due to the fact that the population is equally divided between the local Muslims and the Pashtuns. And this was again a big game of adventure, because this was considered to be a great fighting nation, and with the jingoism and the fascination for war and establishing the military glory, the desired posting for administrators as well as soldiers was on the northwest frontier, and they thought that the Afghans and Pathans had a weird code, even though they were fierce fighters, and a man could make his career in that if he succeeded and outshined in the army. And one well-known correspondent who rose to prominence in the early 20th century is well known to the entire world. His name happens to be Winston Churchill. He was a correspondent, young correspondent for one of the newspapers, and he was itching to seek border action, but instead of leading a battalion, ended up writing reports, rather flowering reports of the war and glorifying the war. And that was probably the first and only time he visited India, and in the beginning of his career. And later on, obviously, was much more active in the English politics, as we all know. Now, not all the viceroys were. There were several people who were influenced by the liberal traditions of Britain and the Gladstonian philosophy. And one of the ones who deserves a special mention was named Lord Ripon. He was liberal, and he tried to govern India with a more even hand. And again, he realized that some of the policies that were instituted by invading Afghanistan were rather foolish, and he decided to make peace with the Afghans, and in return for no further ventures on either side. And again, he established certain rules and regulations in India which were quite popular. Now, at that time, the Indians had established enough education that they were being appointed as lower court judges, and he passed several bills, and which allowed the Indian judges to try even Europeans in the court. And now this bill was strongly opposed by the European and the British establishment, primarily by the tea merchants, and because of that, the bill was finally dropped and Lord Ripon was recalled back. So the racist elements were up in arms against being tried by Indian judges. Now, this showed the example as to how the class distinction and the air of arrogance had taken hold in the British establishment. Now, again, by that time, there were the Britishers wanted to establish a legitimacy by continuing the Mughal Empire. So they had decided to rebuild Delhi, which was ravaged during the mutiny, and they decided to build part of the New Delhi in European Indo-Saracen fashion. And this was done by a famous architect, Sir Edward Lutyens, and he established the big imposing Viceroy, the India Gate, and which was one of the biggest private residence buildings with row of bungalows. When it takes as many as 600 servants and 400 gardeners to maintain this establishment, and this was the seat of power, and Delhi has been the capital of India from times immemorial. So there was a kind of a subtle message that was being delivered as to that the British Empire was the legitimate heir to the Mughal Empire, which they had vanquished. Now, these are some of the, we talked somewhere about the famines earlier and the migration. And now, again, the most famous writers of that time was Rudyard Kipling, and who is quoted the well overly utilized phrase of East is East and West is West, and was a strong imperialist and encouraged the jingoism and racism that was the order of the day. And again, he thought that we were the superior or the chosen races. And again, at that time, they had a strange fascination for the so-called martial and the fighting races, and especially such as the Muslims and the Rajputs and the Gurkhas, and they had stronger dislike of the educated Indians because they were considered that even though they were educated and they were considered as a threat to the integrity of the empire. And so he was a big literary figure who documented some of the history of the British Empire in the early 20th century. Now, one of the well-known and progressive viceroy was one of the who is who of the British upper classes named Lord Curzon, and he had a very strong opinion of himself and tried to institute several reforms in India, and at the same time was vastly unpopular due to the fact that he decided to divide the province of Bengal, which was rather large and was difficult to administer, and this was opposed by the local Hinduist and Bengali establishment because it appeared, at least on paper, that the division was strictly or encouraged to divide the Muslim and the Hindu community, as the predominance of the Muslims was in the eastern part and the western part was Hindu. And so this was strongly opposed and leading to various protests and riots in Bengal and Orissa. And again, so these agitations continued for several years, and finally, the order to divide was rescinded in 1910. Now, again, we must mention that some of the Maharajas were left alone, and there were as many as 600 various princely kingdoms which were left to their own devices as long as they did not acquire independent military power, and they were allowed to tax the people and use the revenue as they chose. And most of them were rather self-indulgent. Some of them had serious drinking problems and were rather poor administrator and despotic rulers. But there were a few who were progressive, and one good example of this is a relatively medium-sized kingdom of Baroda, as it was called. Baroda is the Indianized name, and the prince there was quite progressive, and he was educated in the Western tradition. He educated his wives, established various colleges, and sent his own children to Oxford and Cambridge to study. and also was a huge sympathizer for for Indian independence, and donated several hundred rupees for financing the Indian National Congress, which was uh, founded in 1885. And again, the tradition of the Delhi darbars continued, and to mimic the Red Fort, which was the seat of the Mughal Empire, the equally large and impressive building of Viceroy Palace was erected, as we discussed a few minutes earlier. And this was the time that a few progressive Europeans thought that the educated Indians had a right to represent themselves and present their grievances to the English, and that led to the foundation of Indian National Congress. There was a mixture of all the nationalities of well-educated lawyers and teachers. A majority of them were Hindus, some were Zoroastrians or Parsis, and a few were Muslims. And there were a few scattered Englishmen who established a political forum, which was established in 1885. That was the first foundation of the political organization of Indians to present their grievances and to make appeals to the British Empire to participate in, have some political views and express their opinion. And initially, this was not primarily confined to the cities, and was more of a debating body, and they sent out various petitions, and they wanted to work in collaboration, and were interested in acquiring what later on to be known as Home Rule for India. And this movement continued peacefully for at least another first 20 or 30 years, until the arrival of a more powerful force from in the name of Mahatma Gandhi, or Gandhi as he was called. Now, Gandhi grew up in one of the princely states in Gujarat, and was trained as a barrister, but was rather unsuccessful. So he was packed off to East Africa to work for some Indian businessmen. Now there, for the first time, he saw a blatant racist discrimination, and that led to the rise of non-violent protest. Now at that time, his history in South Africa is rather colorful, that he, at the same time, he helped the British Empire during the Boer War, and worked as a volunteer ambulance carrier. And subsequently, he was able to rescind the tax that was imposed on the Indian community. And due to his successful agitation and the new techniques for protest, nonviolent protest that he had instituted in South Africa, the word of his popularity traveled to Bombay. And when he came, he obviously assumed the leadership of the Indian National Congress very quickly, and transformed it from a rather debating body to a powerful political establishment in a span of about 10 to 20 years. And he was, and he spread the membership from a few hundred to several millions, and Congress became the big political power to challenge the British establishment over the next 50 years. And now, before the rise of Congress, there were other freedom fighters who must be mentioned, including one of the earliest ones, who was again a well-educated Brahmin, and who was described even by the British as father of the Indian unrest. And he was born right after the mutiny, and he is the first one who quoted that self-rule is my birthright, which inspired. And he was not a pacifist, to put it mildly, and his writings were rather inflammatory and inspired quite a few local youth to take up agitation and protests in some in violent forms. And he, after several years, he was sent to exiled to a jail outside of India for several years, and was allowed to return with the promise that he will not write political pamphlets. And but again, and his influence gradually waned with the rise of Gandhi, and he was older than Gandhi, and after him, the Gandhi's nonviolent movement took over and became the main mode of protest for the Indian population. Now, there's only one time that Gandhi and Churchill might have come across was in Africa, and again, neither of them had a strong love for each other, and Churchill was a strong proponent of empire, and even when Gandhi was popular and was respected as the main leader of the Indian establishment, Churchill had rather quite a few negative feelings and statements about Gandhi, and neither of them saw eye to each other. And one of the interesting books that was written was Churchill and Gandhi, and it makes an interesting reading for those who are interested in the personalities of two strong-willed people. Now, we mentioned about the partition of Bengal earlier, and that was one of the big reason which instituted the Indians and became that the Britishers were at least subtly and perhaps not so subtly practicing a policy of divide and rule, and the policy and encouraging the Muslims to seek separate existence continued, and to be well culminating into the partition of subcontinents in 1947 with monumental tragedies. Now, and again, at that time, some of the protests were not quite as benign as they were thought. And nationalism was on the rise, and several British administrators of middle level were attacked by throwing bombs, and several Bengalis were arrested. Some were hanged, and the agitation in the Bengal just continued for several years. Now, by that time, the Indians had traveled all over the world, including one of the sidelines that was, along with the traveling to the West for education. The big export from India was the religious teachers, and some of the well-known teachers who traveled not just to Britain but also to the United States, and that could be the start of the yoga tradition to America. And one of the well-known one is Swami Vivekananda, who traveled to America at an all-religious conference in 1890s to Chicago and mesmerized the American population. It was immensely popular, and unfortunately he died at a rather young age. And that was probably the first encounter of Hindu culture in the Western Hemisphere. And that continued with various swamis and yogis who were rather influential. And one of the most popular books that is still being sold and is Autobiography of a Yogi. And now, again, some of the primary reason for the empire was money, because it was not just for raw material that India was able to export, but India was also a captured market for manufactured goods. And at the same time, India was one of the few colonies that paid for herself. And one of the ways that in which the most poorest people were taxed by what came to be known as salt tax. And so much so that the salt was grown obviously on the seaside, and in the desert salt was had to be exported from the coastal areas. So in order to collect salt, the British Empire had established something called as inland custom line. A thorny hedge was built, and every few miles that policemen were positioned to collect tax from the people who could least afford to pay it. And that again, and Gandhi being a wily politician, he in 1930 he collected opposition to salt tax by making salt on the Arabian Sea coast in 1930, and that was well dramatized in the movie Gandhi. Well, he broke the law and was jailed by a non-violent protest to the salt works in somewhere near Bombay. Now again, they at the same time there were the Muslims were somewhat late in getting to politics, but All India Muslim League was established in 1906, and initially, they worked in collaboration with the Indian National Congress, but later on they realized that they were always being minority, and they had some legitimate concerns. At the same time, they were encouraged by the British as to that there would not be anybody to speak for the minorities, and that led gradually to not seeing eye to eye, and some of the leaders decided that the Muslim majority areas, which were primarily in the west, on the borders near Afghanistan, and on the east on the Burmese border, should separate out, and that eventually the political separation became wider and wider, leading to the creation of Pakistan in 1947. Now, again, a few numbers of Indians had traveled to America, and from America they had established agitation for Indian freedom, and some of them had traveled after the First World War, and even before the First World War, to Canada, being a former British colony, and they had settled as farmers in California and in Canada. And now by this time they were becoming politically active and had started publishing newspapers and pamphlets, and had established a political party for Indian freedom. And the British tried to discourage it, and had enough spies and put enough pressure on Americans government to keep an eye on the what they call agitators, and some of them had clear-cut communist sympathies. Now, one of the ugly incidents that took place was a ship that traveled from Calcutta via Hong Kong to Canada with a large number of Sikhs who were told that they could settle anywhere in the British Empire, but the Canadian government, when the ship arrived to the port of Vancouver, forcefully did not allow the people to disembark, and was after several days the ship had to be turned back to Calcutta, and some of them were arrested. And again, there was an ugly incident that finally, after Second World War, the Canadian Prime Minister apologized for the treatment, and obviously the cause for rejecting them was race-based. Now, again, while the agitations continued from 1885, and various skirmishes took place in the south as well as in the north and in Bengal, but with the start of the World War I, the Indians diaspora and establishment, including the Congress Party, had decided that they would be better off supporting the empire, with the hope that if the Indians participated in the war, then they would certainly be given a right to home rule, or even a dominion status, which was granted to Australia and New Zealand by that time. Little did they know that they would be sorely disappointed. And the Indians served in various theaters in the Middle East and Egypt during the First World War, and also served in Europe, as it is apparent by this French lady who is trying to offer flowers and food to the Sikh soldiers. Now again, when the Sikh soldiers were hurt and were transported to Britain, the British establishment, especially the conservative one, was chagrined with the idea of white nurses having to treat what by that time what they used to call coolies or niggers. But again, some of them, the soldiers were treated fairly when they were tolerated. But again, by traveling to Europe, it opened up their eyes as to see what the world was. And again, when the people that returned, they realized that their conditions were uh, quite horrid back home. And again, that led to a rise of a lot of discontent amongst returning soldiers. And again, they were poorly equipped to fight the modern trench warfare, and because they were undersupplied, undertrained, and primarily worked on the back lines, and they were not, and a lot of them, they had a high amount of casualties that took place. And again, they now it's an interesting thing as to by that time the communism had conquered, had taken hold of in Russia, and the Britishers were afraid with the communist overtures with Afghanistan and Iran, and that led to what came to be known as the Third Afghan War. And this would be an interesting way as to what actually happened. I'll let you play.
In the 19th century, Britain fought 2 wars with Afghanistan as it sought to control the region and create a buffer between its Indian dominions and Tsarist Russia. It was part of what became known as the Great Game. In 1879, a deal was struck in which Kabul agreed to trade its foreign policy for British cash. But everything changed in 1919 with the assassination of the Afghan emir Habibullah Khan. Habibullah's third son, Amanullah Khan, seized power, declaring full independence from Great Britain and launching a jihad against the British Raj. And so the Third Anglo-Afghan War began in May 1919, as Afghan troops crossed the frontier at the western end of the Khyber Pass, taking the strategic town of Bagh. The British sent in companies of Sikhs and Gurkhas, as well as British infantry. They were supported by Royal Air Force bombing raids on Bagh and the Afghan cities of Dhaka and Jalalabad. Handley Page bombers even struck Kabul. After retaking Bagh and Dhaka, British Indian forces moved deeper into Waziristan, but soon encountered problems. Local militia they had enlisted either deserted or turned on their paymasters. Sensing an opportunity, the Afghan army attacked Tal inside pre-partition India, setting fire to food supplies and besieging British positions. The British called in reinforcements and RAF bombers to drive out the Afghan troops. But fearing more air raids, Emir Amanullah was already suing for peace. An armistice was agreed in June, and the Treaty of Rawalpindi was signed on August the 8th. The war had lasted just a few weeks, but had taken more than 2,000 lives. The British claimed a tactical victory, having repulsed an Afghan invasion, but Emir Amanullah was now in full control of his country's foreign policy. In 1921, he signed a treaty of friendship with Soviet Russia. Afghanistan retained its independence until the Soviet invasion of 1979.
Now again, now the Indian establishment and the political establishment had a strong hope for reform, and but on the other hand, all they got was more strong restriction due to fear of Russian influence in India, and various conferences were held, and some of them did not were appeared promising initially, but did not amount to much, and due to both sides holding to their guns and the slow pace of reform. And now at that time, Gandhi started agitation with non-cooperation. Now again, as it turns with a lot of non-cooperation movements, it turned violent rather quickly, and several policemen were killed. There were huge agitations that took place in various parts of the country, and various English and citizens and European citizens were killed, and that almost shook Gandhi that this, and he decided to call off the agitation. And again, this the pace of violence again reinforced the British resolve to put even more pressure on the establishment, leading to various acts of prohibiting assembly, and even the regular protests that were allowed earlier were crushed with military force, leading to one of the biggest tragedy, which turned the entire mood of the Indian population. And this was a place called Jallianwala Bagh, which is a small area in the city of Amritsar, which is the capital of Punjab, a predominant population being Sikh. And these several hundred people had gathered to hear a couple of the political speeches. And now at that time, curfew was in effect. Now the local governor and the military commander, in order to teach the lesson, decided to send a battalion of British as well as Gurkha soldiers to attack this gathered force. Now the area that had limited entrances and had rather narrow passageway, and without any warning they opened a fire, and as many as 1,500 rounds were fired on unarmed people, and 360 to 70 people were killed, 1,500 were wounded. And after that, people were not just no assistance was offered, and this shocked initially the news was suppressed, but it gradually filtered out all across India, as well as to the British Parliament. And people were horrified that the British, who always claimed that they would wanted to treat people fairly and with civility, and this shocked not just Indians but the British Parliament as well. And now to pour oil over the fire, the general, the Dyer, who was the military colonel who was in charge of this, was given a huge purse and reward by the British and the European establishment, and that again can be, and he was forced to retire, and a trial was carried out, but instead of being punished for his assault on unarmed civilians, he was given an honorary retirement and retired to England, along with the special reward that was collected for him by the various citizens of European ancestry. And again, the memorial this is still very valid in Amritsar, India, and these are some of the scenes of the massacre that took place. And since that time, the Indian political establishment realized that there cannot be any peaceful coexistence, and the agitation that had started back in 1885 had to continue. Now, and again, we talked about the Gandhi Salt March earlier, that he selected this after a hiatus of about 10 or 15 years. He decided to restart the non-violent movement, and exemplified by the Salt March that took place. And it was, to his credit, and his followers credit, this was uh, markedly peaceful in spite of the unarmed civilians being beaten by sticks, and eventually they were arrested, and he ended up spending at least a few years in jail. And now, as it's known, that Gandhi had continued to negotiate with the British establishment and had traveled to England on various what came to be known as various roundtable conferences.
Charlie's getting a wonderful reception from the crowd.
So, in spite of the fact that Gandhi was determined to kick the British out, he was immensely popular when he visited Britain amongst the lower classes, and was popular in Ireland as well. Now, the situation in the Second World War was quite different due to the fact that when the World War II started, by that time the Congress Party had fought several elections and were in power in various states and controlled a huge number of assemblies and were de facto the political voice of the whole subcontinent. But without consenting, the Congress Party, the Viceroy at that time, decided that India was a part of the Second World War, and this led to a big fracture between the Congress Party, Muslim League, and the Empire. And as opposed to Congress Party, the Muslim League decided to cooperate with the British rule and continued to build up a political strength in the areas of Muslim majority. And again, this may have been one of the big reasons for the partition, as to the Congress Party decided not to support the Second World War, while the Muslim League continued to support Britain. Now, again, in spite of the fact that the Congress Party was not participating in Second World War and continued the protest movement throughout the war, quite a few of their leaders were in jail for several years. Huge number of Indians did serve the war, primarily due to the fact that war was a source of employment for several tribes, especially the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, and the Rajputs, and as many as 1.7 million Indians served in various theaters in Second World War, and out of which they had 23,000 deaths. As you can see, that now this was again during both wars. India was the source of raw material, but after the First World War, Indian industries got a kickstart with this founding of the Tata steel mills, various cotton mills, and some of the industrial manufacturing took rise between the two wars. And slowly but steadily, the subcontinent, which was primarily agrarian, was being transferred and becoming part of the global trade. And so much so that at the end of the Second World War, the British government owned Indian government several hundred million pounds as debt, and so the balance of trade was turning in favor of the Indian subcontinent. Now, the Indian National Congress had division amongst itself that one of the Bengali Congress leaders was not in favor of non-violent movement that Gandhi was the leader of, and he had fractioned out separately from 1910 and was jailed by the British, and as he managed to go into hiding, and by land route he managed to escape from Bengal all the way on land route and ended up in Germany. But the Nazi Germany paid him primarily lip service, and by submarine he managed to travel to Japan, and the Japanese were a lot more sympathetic. And after the fall of Singapore and Malaya, a huge number of Indian Army soldiers were prisoners of Japanese, and the Japanese played the Asia card very well, and turned the whole war as to fight of the Asians against the Europeans. And the Indian National Army was formed under the leadership of Subhas Bose, and the army had substantial strength. There were as many as 80,000 soldiers who volunteered to work for the Indian National Army. Now, by that time, the Japanese supplies lines were stretched, but they did manage to come all the way to the Burmese border. And by that time, the Americans had entered the war, and with the might of America and with the support of China, the Indian National Army and the Japanese were bogged down into the jungles of Assam and Bengal and Burma. And again, and by that time the war was winding down, and the Axis powers were on the losing end. Now, after the end of the war, the Britishers were losing control, and this was evidenced by the fact that even the Royal Indian Navy, there was a mutiny which took place by that time. There was substantial communist influence, and the sailors of the Indian Navy attacked Bombay and almost took control of the Bombay, and several Europeans were killed. And they were sympathetic to the Indian National Army, which was some of the soldiers were put on trial in Delhi, and they again rightfully refused to attack the civilians, and this was a big shock to the empire. And it was by that time it was realized that the handwriting was on the wall, and they were not only short of the manpower, but short of political will to continue the empire, because they were losing control rather rapidly and were anxious to get out. And the change of the government from the Tory establishment, as you may recall, Winston Churchill lost the election, and the Labour Party was anxious to get out of India as quickly as possible. Had a large Muslim population, and when the irregulars and from the northwest frontiers infiltrated and attacked the army of Kashmir and went through rape and pillage, and that at the last minute he decided to sign joining the Indian Union, and the Indian Army finally landed in Kashmir and repelled the invasion that took place from the northwest frontier. Now, this was one of the biggest tragedies that took place, that as many as 10 million people crossed the border. The Muslims went to Pakistan, and the Sikhs and Hindus returned to India, and there was a tragedy of epic proportion, and that's been well summarized in Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. And a huge number of bloodshed took place on both sides. People were killed in trains and in their homes. Huge number of homes and farms were torched. Women were raped, and this it just continued for several years. And the bone of contention, the fight between the two neighbors, has still continued until the present day, and they've managed to fight 3 wars, and they are both now nuclear powered, as we very well know. And this was some of the scenes of the tragedy of partition. As you can see, that the army was totally unable to control the human tragedy and the massacre that took place.